This edition of Monocle on Saturday was first broadcast on the 24th of August 2024. Hello, I'm Georgina Godwin, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. This is Monocle on Saturday. Coming up on today's programme, we'll have a look through the papers with political analyst and author Charles Hecker. Then we speak to Bristol-born street artist Sickboy on the link between graffiti and political unrest. And we'll talk to the cinematic music producer Oscar Osicki about how he translates music to film. That's all ahead here on Monocle on Saturday. First, though, here's the news. President Joe Biden spoke by phone to leaders of Qatar and Egypt on Friday, pushing for an elusive Gaza ceasefire for hostages deal as negotiators met in Cairo to try and overcome remaining obstacles. Meanwhile, the Palestinian news agency Wafa reported that at least 12 Palestinians, including 2 children and a woman, were killed early this morning by Israeli attacks, and at least 15 others were injured. German police say they're still searching for an unknown assailant hours after he killed 3 people and wounded 8 others in a stabbing attack at a festival in North Rhine-Westphalia, Germany's most populous state which borders the Netherlands. And US independent presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. abandoned his campaign on Friday and endorsed Republican Donald Trump, ending a run that he began as a Democrat, trading on one of the most famous names in American politics. Kennedy recently revealed he dumped a dead bear in New York City's Central Park a decade ago and staged it to look like a bike accident. He also claimed he had a brain worm. His campaign confirmed he had had a parasite in his brain, but has since fully recovered. And that's your Monocle Radio News. Hello and welcome to Monocle on Saturday. I'm joined in the studio by my good friend Charles Hecker, political analyst and author of the upcoming book Zero Sum about international business in Russia. Charles, welcome back.
Good morning, Georgina.
I can hardly keep a straight face. RFK?
We've been preceded by a brain worm and a dead bear, and that's a great way to open the show. Yeah, we've had, so basically American politics, Georgina, is saving us from the silly season here in the UK as August draws to a close, a traditionally very, very slow news month where newspapers might be struggling to put interesting and genuine news onto their front pages. But we have been saved by the Democratic National Convention and even more recently by Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s withdrawal from the presidential race. And this is a very interesting American political moment. RFK Jr., of course, coming from the legendary Kennedy family, son of RFK, Robert F. Kennedy, assassinated in 1968, brother of John F. Kennedy, assassinated in 1963. Very long backstory there. But basically his months-old presidential campaign has come to an end. You'll recall that he initially declared as a Democrat and struck panic in Democratic camps because it was people were wondering to what extent he would take votes away from Joe Biden. What a difference a few months make. President Biden has, of course, withdrawn from the race. RFK Jr. declared as an independent. And famously twinned with his vice presidential candidate, who is the ex-wife of one of the founders of Google. If this could get any more complicated, in any event, he has withdrawn from the race and he's thrown his support behind President Trump and his candidacy. And what the papers are telling us in the U.S., including a fairly chunky headline in the New York Times, is that freshly earlier this year, RFK Jr. was saying that President Trump was unsuitable for office. All of a sudden, they're on stage together embracing.
It's extraordinary. And if anybody's unsuitable for office, surely it's the man who staged a dead bear in Central Park looking as if it had had a bike crash. I mean, this stuff is unbelievable.
Yeah, this is all of a political piece, I suppose, also with, cast your mind back to Mitt Romney tying his dog to the roof of his car and some of the other sort of animal-related political shenanigans that we've seen in campaigns over the years. Robert F. Kennedy was always an outlier, known primarily for his anti-vax views. He's a strong environmentalist and had been making a lot of environmental causes, although, surely gaining no affection with the animal rights lobby. But his strongest and most salient point, and what people will remember him for, is his vaccine skepticism. We wonder what the deal is between Trump and Kennedy to earn his endorsement. Whether he'll become health secretary in a potential Trump administration is yet to be determined. President Trump seems to have promised him some sort of role in a national autism council, looking into the medical origins of autism. But we now have political analysts in the U.S. scratching their heads about what this means for who's going to lose and who's going to win as a result of this alliance. And, the Democrats, he was no longer a threat to the Democrats because once President Biden withdrew from the race, that was the primary threat to Democratic victory in November. And the Democratic Party, as we've seen over the past 4 or 5 days, has unanimously and overwhelmingly come behind Kamala Harris, who is now on the heels of what has been, called an extremely successful convention in Chicago by political observers of all stripe. And so Kennedy is no longer a threat to the Democrats. He'll bring some votes to the Republicans. Whether this is a really big boost to Trump is unlikely.
Well, of course, many column inches this week on the DNC, which, as you say, was deemed a huge success even by Republicans.
That's right. So the primary goal of the DNC, well, there were a number of goals for the convention this past week. But we have to remind ourselves that this election is boiling down to small handfuls of undecided voters in small groups of states scattered across the country. And so one of the goals of the Democratic National Convention was to help people who are undecided make up their minds, and people who are wavering in their allegiance to Trump to bring them over. And you had Republican speakers at the podium of a Democratic Party convention saying extraordinary things. And I don't think this has ever happened, that you've seen somebody from the opposition speak, in the evangelical tent of a Democratic political rally. And so very forcefully from the podium, you had former Representative Adam Kinzinger, who said that he doesn't support Trump. He was a never Trumper who stepped down from his office in Congress. And then you had very famously Oprah Winfrey wearing a purple dress representing the combination of red and blue colors for the Democrats and the Republicans, saying that she is a registered independent and that she will be voting for Kamala Harris come November. This is important because is this a lamentable fact of American politics? Is that celebrities are trusted more than politicians. So you get Oprah Winfrey, who is the number one most trusted celebrity figure in the United States in poll after poll, getting up there saying, I'm an independent, I've made up my mind, I'm voting for Kamala Harris, the vice president. And that was the goal of the convention, is to get every independent to say those exact same words.
Now, there was one celebrity who didn't turn up.
That's right. So this is another part of the wonderful bazaar that is American politics. And the networks who are broadcasting the convention noticed that in the final night of the convention, when Vice President Harris gets up and formally accepts the nomination for president and makes her most impassioned pitch to the public, there was a gap in the schedule. And a rumor started on X, formerly known as Twitter, as rumors, the place where rumors most frequently start, that this gap in the programming schedule, in the agenda of the DNC that night, was intentionally left open for a mystery guest. And suddenly you had reporters and aviation geeks all over the world tracking the aircraft that normally belonged to Taylor Swift and Beyonce and wondering if they were making landings in Chicago. This is an interesting sort of own goal in a way, because there was such global commotion over the likelihood that Taylor Swift or Beyonce would show up on the last night of the DNC, that when they didn't, there was a certain air of disappointment. But this is a rumor that started outside of Democratic political circles. The Washington Post has a dissection of how this rumor basically fooled everyone in the world. I mean, that's in the headline, how a rumor about Beyonce at the DNC fooled the world. And I suppose we're in the position of now thinking that somebody who we thought was going to support the candidacy of Vice President Harris pulled out. That's not true.
Mm. And I mean, Beyonce, I mean, she's allowed Harris to use her song Freedom, hasn't she? And I personally think that they may be just keeping their powder dry. I mean, because there will be this bounce now in the polls after the convention, and they may need another push a little bit closer in, and that's when you roll out Taylor Swift or Beyonce.
Well, that's right. And Taylor Swift will likely have something to say later in the campaign, because Donald Trump, just this past week, in part of his ongoing attempts to hijack the high of the Democratic National Convention, claimed that Taylor Swift is endorsing him.
And he faked photographs.
That's right. And nothing of the sort has taken place. And there may come a moment later in the campaign, exactly as you point out, particularly since this will be a very, very close contest. There may come a moment when Taylor Swift needs to say, not only do I not endorse President Trump, but, here's who I do endorse.
Well, let's talk about Trump, because his behaviour during her speech was extraordinary. The New York Times is telling us all about what happened on Fox News.
So the president is, people say that, the Republicans weren't paying any attention to the Democratic National Convention. And we know that Trump is riveted to television almost 24/7, that he watches himself on television. He watches other politicians on television. He watches Fox News and he watches the rival networks. And he was watching Kamala Harris and the rest of the pageantry at the DNC, all of whom had something to say about him. And the Democrats have actually changed tactic a little bit. And, when Michelle Obama famously said, when they go low, we go high, well, the Democrats are going a little bit medium these days, and they've decided to take some pot shots at President Trump's character. And he was having absolutely nothing of it. He dialed into Fox News live during the DNC, during their coverage of the DNC. And, when the president or the former president calls, you pick up. And I think they've lived to regret that.
I mean, because he just wouldn't shut up, would he?
No. So the Fox News broadcasters who were covering the DNC tried repeatedly to break into him, into this monologue, and to try to get him to answer questions and actually to get off the personal attacks on Vice President Harris. Everyone is trying to get Donald Trump to talk about policy. Well, and Vice President Harris, to be fair.
Yeah.
And both of them so far are refusing. Harris is refusing in a way that sort of steers her towards fairly general platitudes about affordable housing and healthcare and tax cuts and strong military. President Trump cannot move off personal attacks on Kamala Harris.
And indeed on Biden. I mean, he was tweeting, "Where is Hunter?" That was his first tweet. It was like, how is this at all relevant?
It isn't. As a lot of things that former President Trump has been saying in politics lately, there is a new effort in Congress to try to impeach the president and to try to prosecute Hunter Biden, again, based on absolutely no evidence whatsoever. So literally, Fox News had to pull the plug on the president by switching away from their coverage of the DNC temporarily before returning. And, this has happened before. And when the president calls in live, any broadcaster takes an enormous risk with what might be happening to their live feed. And he completely hijacked Fox News to hilarious result.
I mean, it was very, very funny to read about. I wish I'd seen it too. I wasn't glued to coverage of the DNC. I certainly wasn't glued to Fox News. One of the other punches that he tried to land on the Democratic campaign is that he said that everyone is calling Kamala Harris's running mate Tim Walz Coach Walz because he was a football coach, and Trump chimes in by saying he wasn't a coach, he was an assistant coach, and sort of that level of
bullying almost of the Democratic ticket didn't go over very well.
No, not at all. Not at all. Listen, I want to talk briefly before we return to politics about Japan and the shortage of rice.
Yes. So we're going to the Japan Times right now for a story about how supermarket shelves in Japan are empty in the rice sections. And I was looking at this piece in the Japan Times with a certain level of shock, because this is almost the same thing as reading a piece in a British newspaper that says, pubs run out of beer. And so there's a number of sort of economic, demographic, and environmental drivers behind this crisis. It is, we should say, anticipated to be short-lived. But shoppers who are walking into Japanese supermarkets looking to top up on their stacks of rice are walking away empty-handed. A couple of things have happened. There was a surplus of rice following the pandemic because restaurants were working less and buying and serving less rice. And so that surplus has gone away. There have been a couple of minor earthquakes in Japan recently, and there are forecasts of a larger earthquake to come. Japanese buyers are, to a certain degree, panic buying rice. And what that did is it sort of wiped out supplies. And then finally, the autumn harvest of rice is yet to come, but will be starting soon. And there is typically a lull in advance of the autumn harvest. And so if you take all these factors together, you wind up with a rice shortage in Japan, which just sort of doesn't sort of trip across the eyes very easily when you're reading the newspapers and stood out.
Mm-hmm. Let's cross now to the Moscow Times. And this, of course, we know that Ukraine has been pushing into the Kursk region. And this means Russia is really occupied for the first time since the Second World War. That's right.
And so Russia and Ukraine and Ukraine's allies are still digesting the fact that Ukrainian troops crossed the border into the Kursk region last week and have seized an enormous chunk of Russian territory. And the Moscow Times, which is publishing in exile from Amsterdam online, is periodically sending reporters into and out of combat zones in Russia at great danger to those reporters who are on the ground. And they've reported from inside the Kursk region and have done some very, very interesting and really compelling reporting and some vox pop work on the ground there. And what they're telling us under a headline that says, "Everyone is on their own. In battlefield Kursk region, civilians feel forgotten by their own country." And the story here is that some of the people who live in the Kursk region are blaming Ukraine, of course, for invading their territory and taking control of dozens and dozens of villages and small towns. Although, to be fair, it should be pointed out that one of the more salient features of this Ukrainian invasion is that they came and they started passing out humanitarian aid, including fresh water, to the villages that they occupied, in very stark contrast to the behavior of Russian troops when they take over Ukrainian territory. And so there are some Russians on the ground in Kursk saying that they're blaming the Ukrainians, but there are a number of citizens on the ground who are blaming their own government for what's happened, saying that, we've been taken over by external forces and nobody's come to help us. President Putin, the story points out, has yet to make any public comment on what's happened in Kursk. And so as far as the rest of the country is concerned, they only know what they are or are not being told about the Kursk invasion. And there has been reference to the situation in Kursk in national media in Russia, but really nothing beyond that.
Of course, Russia is your USP, and your book is about to be published about it. And I wondered if you could just give us an outline of what it's about, Zero Sum.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Georgina. So the book is about the adventure, if you will, of international business in Russia over the past 30 years. And if you take a step back and look at what's happened since the Russian market opened in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union and then essentially closed with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. If you take a step back and look at this is one of the greatest experiments ever in global capitalism. And that is that an enormous market opened for business that had been hermetically sealed to outside involvement during the Soviet period. Business goes rushing in to Russia with a bunch of assumptions about how that country would work and how that market and its politics would unfold. Over the course of 30 years, those assumptions came under enormous pressure, of course, culminating with the fact that the country declared war on Ukraine. And with the exact same velocity that companies rushed into Russia in 1991, 92, they evacuated from Russia in 2022. And so the book sort of takes a look at that arc of Russia's debut as an emerging market in the early 90s and its exit from that stage in 2022.
Charles, I wonder how much space there is for dissent in Russia these days, and are we seeing it? Do the public act this out in terms of perhaps, I don't know, slogans, graffiti, etc.?
So they don't. And there is a sort of re-Sovietization going on in Russia, and that's perhaps a bit of an overstatement because you have to really think about certain features of the Soviet period when you talk about the re-Sovietization. But dissent in Russia is now severely, swiftly punished. You'll remember, Georgina, because we've talked about this here before in the studio, that the simple act of walking onto a public space and holding up a blank sheet of paper, let alone an elaborate piece of political graffiti, but holding up a blank sheet of paper in Russia leads to an immediate arrest. And so that kind of graphic representation of political speech in Russia is now not only frowned upon, but harshly punished.
Well, let's talk about graffiti here, because Sickboy is one of the leading artists to emerge from Bristol's infamous graffiti scene to worldwide recognition. With a legacy that reaches back to 1995, he was first recognised for his symbology and text-based street art, the iconic red and yellow street logo, the Temple, as well as his Save the Youth slogan that have featured on walls and wheelie bins across the world. And Sickboy joins us now to speak about that. Many thanks for coming on the show. Tell us, describe to us your work.
Okay, so my work's sort of rooted in graffiti, like you say. So I started, mainly around 1999, I started doing this logo. So I'm sort of named as being one of the first people in the UK to use a logo instead of letters. And then from there, I just I went into painting. Basically, I've been painting canvases with acrylic, spray paint, and they are psychedelic in nature, if you like. And then I go from anywhere from painting to installation. So I've just done shows around the world for the last sort of 20 years, really. And that's what I do for a living now.
And Sickboy, why do you think that street art is back on the rise?
I don't really. Well, I know that tools like Instagram make it easy to share work. For me, it's lost a little bit of its soul because of that. But it also seems that it's more widely accepted. I think since sort of around 2008. And you had the big rise of, Banksy coming to fame and a lot of recognition for other artists on the street art scene, if you like. I just think it's become more acceptable as an art form, and graffiti has a knock-on effect from that. So I just feel like you see a lot more of it in the street. Yeah.
And what is the connection then? How would you link political unrest and street art?
I think that, more radical graffiti that gets messages across that are political is obviously going to rise when there is political angst, if you like. So recently, with the riots, etc., you'll have people commenting on those sort of topics, and they go hand in hand in a way, because I think all art has a capability to have a voice politically, but street art is public, isn't it? So you don't really need to enter a gallery to see it. So it's something that's more noticeable, if you like, to the general public. That's my thoughts on that matter.
But you do have a show coming up in a gallery, and I understand that some of the work on show has been changed by the fact that you had an accident, a head injury.
Yeah, that's right. So I'm laughing, but there's no laughing matter at the time. So basically, I fell off my bike just outside my house, and I did have a head injury, which led to kind of what's known as a bleed on the brain. So I did not I lost my memory for a month, essentially, which is it's quite complicated in the lead up to a show. And I run a company which is a sort of fine art editions company. So a lot of the work has been led by the fact that I've just wanted to express a lot, I guess. It's just it gave me a real big push creatively. The first thing I started doing was painting butterflies, because my partner at the time said I was like a caterpillar because I was a bit slow. So I just sort of lent into this whole idea of metamorphosis, and I was doing my own butterfly designs, and from there, a lot of scenes and moments that I was thinking from my imagination, all in a very similar format for the wall. So rather than usually in a show I change format and the size of the paintings, this is very formatted, same materials, same colour ranges, but it's all about the line work and the imagery. That's what I'm looking people to focus on.
Sickboy, thank you very much indeed. And his new solo show is at the Muse Gallery in London from the 30th of August. Charles, Banksy, of course, has been much in the news recently.
That's right. One of the UK's, and in fact internationally, one of the most renowned street artists, has had a spate of creativity, much to London's benefit. I suppose this is a question of perspective, but when you see a Banksy in your neighbourhood, it's usually a point of pride and something to brag about. And Banksy has recently decorated London, including the London Zoo, with a number of animal-themed pieces of street art. And the London Zoo, in fact, we're told, has taken recent steps to safeguard the graffiti. Just a couple of months ago, Banksy did a work, I believe it was in Stoke Newington, and what he did was, on the wall behind a tree that had all of its branches cut off, Banksy sort of embellished a very leafy tree in full bloom, only to see that work then vandalized. And so what's happening now is that when Banksy works appear, they are immediately safeguarded and protected, and that's what happens at the London Zoo. There is a Banksy in Shoreditch that is behind a thin sheet of perspex to prevent any further vandalism. And I also noted that Sickboy has done a bit of work in Shoreditch as well.
Very interesting. Now, if you were to put Banksy to music, what would he sound like?
So, it depends on your mood, and it depends upon the Banksy, because they are, of course, enormously diverse. And I've gone through the whole gamut here, from thinking that there are Banksy pieces that make me think of Miles Davis, but there are also Banksy pieces that make me think of the Chemical Brothers. I'm a little bit out of it when it comes to thinking of what potential associations there might be between Banksy and the hip-hop world. But people who know these things better than I do say that there are.
Well, you know what? There is somebody on the line who probably can tell us the answer. His name is Oscar Osicki, and he realised the power of orchestral music when he first saw the Proms at the Royal Albert Hall, and since then has been bringing cinematic-style orchestra music to the masses ever since. He studied music and conducting. He composed music for dozens of venues, festivals and productions, including the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. and the BBC4 radio drama Requiem. He works with artists from the UK, India, Sweden, the US and Argentina to bring music to life for TV and film. He makes music feel cinematic. Oscar, welcome to the programme.
Hi, thank you for having me.
What would Banksy sound like?
I was dreading that question. As soon as he started talking about it, I thought this is going to be a tricky question, because ever since I was 15, I've been mainly obsessed really with the classical music world. Before that, it was heavy metal and rock. But even then, I don't think Banksy would sound like heavy metal and rock. I think your friend's answer of jazz and hip-hop might be more on the mark than orchestral music.
Oscar, won't you just tell us a little bit more of your work? I know we've got a number of clips of it, and one of them is about a sort of classic crossover. Tell us about this and what this all means.
Well, I found myself being obsessed with the orchestra around the age of 15, and I wanted to share that with people really desperately, and I found that most of my peers didn't care. It's not trendy to be into orchestral music, And I started a YouTube channel to show people. I thought people don't know what they're missing, and I want to show them what's out there, what this world means to me. And the YouTube channel really took off and did extremely well. And since then, especially since COVID, I started creating orchestral music which collaborates with pop artists. So orchestra for pop, not unlike the James Bond songs, for example. And I was overwhelmed by how many pop artists or crossover artists wanted orchestra. And I think they want it because it's such an expressive medium. It can tell a story and it can put you in a scene, almost like a film scene, in a way that other genres perhaps couldn't do so vividly.
And could we hear an example? I think this is called Videotape Part 1.
Yeah, right. Well, it's clip 1 from Videotape. Yeah, the song is Videotape. And this first part that we'll hear, it's a classical crossover duo based in London. They're called the Intesa Duo. And they both play viola da gambas, which are sort of grandfathers of the cello. And one of them, Lucine, sings beautifully. And in this clip, the orchestra allows for this moment where the emotions sort of overwhelm you, and it gradually washes over and it subsumes the viola da gambas, sort of wringing out emotion. And, without the orchestra, this was just for solo gambas and voice. But with the orchestra, it allows for a much stronger emotional arc and journey.
Let's listen. I see exactly what you mean. It is very emotional, isn't it? And tell us more now about how your music, or how music generally, can take us from one extreme to the other. And I know you have another clip that actually shows us that.
Well, yeah, exactly. So the orchestra is a very dynamic instrument, if you want to call it that. You can go incredibly loud and powerful, and obviously you can also have the quietest, most cathartic experiences. And so at the end of this song, Videotape, you see how we go from one extreme to the other, from intense emotional journey to a sort of cathartic release, as she reflects on serene blissfulness or a gratitude for life after the struggle. And it's a sense of journey from different extremes that you can have with this music.
Because I know today has been the most perfect day I've ever seen.
Beautiful, really beautiful.
Thank you.
I wonder if you could discuss the idea of how music can paint a scene.
Well, I think we're used to music painting scenes from film music, from great scores of the last 100 years almost. And we're used to this idea of being put in a scene. And music, if you ever watch film without music, that's meant to have music in it, you really sense that something's missing, that something is not putting us properly in the scene. And so, for example, I collaborated with a pop singer, Chloe Edgecombe, who was, she was one of the 3 finalists in Got Talent Argentina, which is their Simon Cowell sort of venture. And she was writing a song with a very desolate story. It was a refugee story, really. And the benefit of a film orchestra there was that it painted a filmic scene. Because I think pop lyrics often have a simple and direct storytelling nature to them. And when you pair this with the storytelling of film music, I think it's a very potent recipe for painting a scene, for putting the listener into a scene.
Let's listen. Gosh, amazing voice, isn't she?
Oh yeah, spine-shivering voice. Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's also this sense that it can take you. I mean, it takes you from one emotional place to a completely different place, and that's just by the cleverness of the composition.
Well, it's perhaps. Oh well, you flatter me, but it's really again this sense of dynamic potential, which is just magnified by having a sort of 80-piece orchestra rather than a 4-piece band or something. So, at the end of this song, Hope, with her voice, it goes from desolation to a sense of rage or almost violent anger. Just a verse later, but the orchestra allows for that magnitude of escalation.
Let's listen.
You still want more? Take all of me. I'll give my strength till I can speak. Don't listen now. You'll hear them cry. No one likes to say goodbye.
Wow, Oscar, what talent. I'm hugely impressed by all of this. How can people learn more about your work?
Well, they can go to Oscar Osicki, OSICKI.com, or they can find my YouTube channel Inside the Score, which not only displays this music, but also teaches an awful lot about orchestral music, past and present. Inside the Score, it's called, on YouTube.
Oscar, thank you very much indeed. Oscar Osicki there, and Inside the Score. Charles, music obviously has such a powerful effect on emotions, and of course one of the times when we use this is for religious music. But I'm thinking here particularly of funerals. People like to sort of choose a tearjerker for a funeral, don't they? But and there are lots of pieces of music that are kind of associated with death, if you like.
That's right. I just want to comment on just how lush and luxurious those first two musical clips were from it's just reassuring to see that orchestras rather than laptops are being used to put music together. And when it comes to funereal music and the plans that you have to make in advance of those sad events, I think you might be alluding to a story in the Times today, and that is a story about Downing Street, under the headline that says Downing Street's plan for when Larry the cat runs out of 9 lives. And so what the Times reminds us of is that Larry the cat, the famous mouser of Downing Street, who rules the roost, much more than the Prime Minister ever does, and inside Number 10. And Larry the cat, of course, has seen lots of Prime Ministers come and go. But Larry the cat himself is 17 years old, we're reminded by the Times. And sadly, Number 10 has to make plans for when the inevitable comes. And they have done this much in the same way and using some of the same plans as they do for royal deaths. And famously, we will remember that, unfortunately, the recent passing of Her Majesty the Queen was called Operation London Bridge. And for Larry the cat, there is Operation Larry Bridges, and so all very keeping and all very appropriate and keeping in the royal in the royal vein. There's no sign that Larry the cat is in bad health. This is wise and prudent succession planning, although there is no immediate plan. As there is in the royal family, there's no immediate plan for a successor to Larry the cat. But the Times tells us that Larry the cat has kindred spirits in lots of other government departments, including the Foreign Office and the Home Office and lots of other places that I think just have mouse problems and need somebody to do a bit of mopping up.
There's a great picture accompanying this with Larry hissing at a Springer Spaniel, which is in fact the same breed as my dog Bella.
Yes, who looks alarmingly the same as a dog sometimes sitting at our feet here in the studio.
Exactly. Very sweet. And speaking of that, it's probably time I went to walk her. Charles, thanks very much for being here today. That's all for Monocle on Saturday. Thanks also to our producer and studio engineer, Mariella Bevan, and to my guests, Charles Hecker, Sickboy and Oscar Osicki. Monocle on Saturday returns next weekend. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.